love to hear your thoughts on really whether you feel your politicians are held to account, whether you're happy with an election every 5 years. Is that enough? Or do we need to look more closely at this issue? I'm turning for guidance first to Dr. John Stanton, an expert in constitutional law and senior lecturer at City Law School, because I think it's important we get an overview about what could be done. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Matthew. Good morning.
It doesn't feel like our politicians are particularly accountable. And even when legislation is introduced to address that, the legislation itself seems somewhat lame. It doesn't seem to get the results that people like myself and perhaps many voters are looking for.
No, indeed, yes. I mean, and there's, of course, there's the distinction here between political accountability and legal accountability.
Yes,
and of
yes.
course, Eric Pickles is obviously no longer an MP, no longer in government. So any sort of political accountability, any political responsibility is pretty limited, if not non-existent, really.
Yes.
Legal accountability, of course, I mean, the inquiry is very clear. The inquiry has a very clear purpose, very clear facts. I mean, that's what an inquiry is. It's a fact-finding enterprise. But yes, it's now from this point down to the police and the government to determine whether further action is needed in this regard.
When you look at something like, say, Grenfell, and then a few years later after that, the politician at the centre of it, David Cameron, is elevated to the House of Lords and then made Foreign Secretary. I mean, in the very broader sense of accountability, what kind of message does that send out?
No, exactly, yes. And it's difficult for the public because the public, they read things in the press, they understand things in public inquiry reports, they see the headlines, and they, in this sense, there's very clear idea of so ex-minister is responsible for this, and as you say, they get appointed to particular positions, they get promoted to the Lords. And there's perhaps a lack of transparency here in understanding or in appreciating why these things happen, why ministers or former ministers get sent to the House of Lords. And it does, I think, send out the wrong message.
Is there a better way, John? That's really what I wanted to hear from you, whether it be a model from abroad or just a different approach that we could take on the issue of accountability, both political and criminal, for our politicians.
I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that government of whatever political hue is at the centre of this. Government is the one that orders public inquiries. Government is the one that really can decide what to do following a public inquiry report. And there is perhaps a need for greater separation there. The idea that government can subcontract out to cladding companies, other housing associations, etc. And government is the one that really decides what happens when things go wrong. And I think this is what generates this sort of the kind of the web of blame. It goes around in circles as to who is responsible, and whether or not government is responsible. That's what we need to determine, and that's what a public inquiry would find. But government is the one that orders the public inquiry. So there is perhaps, I think, a need for greater separation there, greater independence.
But it's not going to come from the very people that we're focused on. They're the ones that could green light that, but then turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So we're stuck. Are we stuck? Is that where we are?
It certainly feels that way, doesn't it? But
yes.
There is this sort of grey area, because once a public inquiry has been ordered, then the robustness, if you like, of the inquiry, the impartiality of the inquiry is clearer. You've got a judge, an independent judge, who makes his findings. So the report itself is usually pretty genuine, and in its fact-finding mission. But yes, it's what government is going to say. Actually, we want to be more accountable. We want to be more at risk of any consequences of our actions. So, we're going to create this institution, create this body, and that's unlikely to happen in this sense.
You've just reminded me of Leveson, of course, and Leveson Part 2, hugely expensive and exhaustive inquiry into press ethics, and it really covered all the areas of concern that I was aware of. And then it was David Cameron again, I think, wasn't it? He just announced, don't worry about it, no, sweep that into the long grass, and it's gone.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And I mean, there are so many examples.
Yes.
Inquiries over the last goodness knows how many years. And to this extent, public inquiries are often just seen as I don't want to say stunts that sort of reduces it to something a bit too basic, I think. But a public inquiry organised by government, ordered by government, indeed, essentially it can appear just this is an important matter. We're going to look into it. This is what we're doing, and in perhaps the vain hope that that's the end of the matter.
Gosh, I was rather hoping there might be a glimmer of light, but listening to you, John Stanton, the picture you paint is exactly the one that I perceive. Now, Will Hutton, columnist for The Observer, over the years has done an amazing job of holding different governments to account. He joins me now. Morning, Will.
Good morning.
The press has been, I suppose, the main tool the public have had to hold politicians to account outside of inquiries. But listening to John and looking at some of the inquiries we've had, really all of the public inquiries we've had in recent years, the accountability aspect just seems to vaporise.
Well, hearing you introduce the programme and kind of the litany of inquiries and disasters from which there's been kind of little consequential action and little consequential kind of penalty paid by kind of the politicians who are at the helm, you are left thinking, my God. Actually, I'm writing about this sort of Morris Observer. I haven't read the whole thing. I read large parts of the Grenfell Inquiry report, and there was one glimmer of hope, which I thought was quite kind of striking. And you put it together with something else that I proposed in a book I've just written called "This Time No Mistakes." You might have, Matthew, a solution.
Go on.
Okay. So Martin Moore-Bick, who's the author of the Grenfell Inquiry, he says that it should no longer be possible for departments, when they get a public inquiry or a select committee in either the House of Commons or House of Lords makes recommendations about whatever it might be, they should be legally required to set out their response, which should be publicly available and publicly transparent. And if they don't do anything, that should be the reasons for inaction should be explained. And I think it's quite radical. He wants that because what happened in Grenfell was that along the way, people were whistleblowers and select committees were saying, this must change. And actually nothing happened, particularly under Lord Pickles. Secondly, what I propose in the book is that every Secretary of State or every minister should be held account, not while they're in office, but actually for up to 6 years or 6 years after they've left office.
Oh, yes.
So you you put those two things together. If you're the Secretary of State, and you're in receipt of a damning document. It could be Levinson, it could be Hillsborough, it could be Grenfell. You can't ignore it. You've got to set out what you're going to do. If you decide to do nothing, you can't sweep it under the carpet. You can't do what Cameron did, which is just to say, nothing's happening. Let's move on. And you hold the guys, the men and women, responsible for 6 years after they've held office.
Can I ask you?
It would be those two things together would be quite transformative, and actually, they're not impossible to do.
They're not. Do you believe? I keep going back to turkeys and Christmas, but do you believe there is the will in Parliament to get to that point?
I think this Parliament is actually keen to do that. I think there's a tremendous sense, and it's one of the reasons why the Conservatives only got 121 MPs, the biggest defeat in modern, since they established the political party, and the fact you've got 412 Labour MPs and the Lib Dems, 72 of them. You've got the fact that the country did what it did in the general election on July the 4th. There was a tremendous sense that actually we had been profoundly misgoverned for 14 years. Across the piece,
I agree with the assertion, but I don't know whether.
And there's a lot of MPs in the House of Commons, particularly the younger ones, who actually, if they were listening to you this morning, and listening to this potential remedy, I think would jump on it.
Okay.
So I think that it was quite interesting listening to Angela Rayner and the Prime Minister himself after Grenfell. There are 58 recommendations. Actually, some of them are no-brainers. Of course, there should be. I mean, some of them really, but they didn't say. They could have said, that some of the no-brainers we're just going to do. And I'm going to tell you, yes, there will be a chief construction advisor. Yes, we will put all the safety stuff into one department. Yes, it's obvious that there should be a fire and rescue college so that kind of firemen actually know simple things like where to find a water hydrant and can communicate by digital radio. I mean, these things are just no-brainers. And actually, they should have just said, we're going to do it. But what was striking was that actually some of the other measures that I proposed are quite, like this one I've just mentioned, have huge ramifications. And I mean,
if they're adopted, Will, and the trouble is, I hope you're right. I just wonder sometimes whether young, clearly focused politicians end up being corrupted, for want of a better word, by the system, a system that has resisted the kind of reforms that Will was alluding to there. Ladies and gentlemen, do we feel our politicians are being held to account properly now? Will they ever vote for themselves to be held to account? 0345 6060 973.